Hi, Brid and Richard of Christies PMP here again, just going to discuss some more tenancy topics, Brid. I think we're going to hit on some landlord tips, specifically some landlord do's and don'ts. There are certain things when landlords are renting property that they absolutely must do, and of course there are other things that they absolutely must not do. So why don't we start with the positives first and just discuss a few things that landlords should be paying attention to when renting property.
Okay. Well, the main things that I've listed and concentrated over the years and compiled into the absolute musts, in my view, are having an inventory list. I mean, an inventory list is one of the most important things, I believe, in starting off a successful tenancy. So having an inventory list with a full list of contents that's in the property, the condition of the property, and ensuring that is checked in with the tenant, that when a tenant moves into a property, that list is up to date as of the date of that tenancy, and that the condition of the property is also listed.
So it's more than just an inventory list as such, it's actually a condition statement.
The condition statement is really important, because that's what determines at the end of a tenancy, when you're checking out the tenant, when they're leaving, vacating the property, you have an agreement and a record of how the property was at the beginning of the tenancy, and it also helps, when it's a must when it comes to checking out. So the inventory list is one of the most important things in my view. And as I said, attending in person at the check-in when a tenant is checking in, to make sure that you actually are there and that you go through everything with them. And again, there's a record of that you did it together. So I think attending with the tenant and getting them to sign that document is very important.
Because we've come across where you would find that the landlord would have just sent the inventory into a tenant, and then they come to us maybe with a problem saying, this damage wasn't there when the tenant moved in, and the tenant would have signed the inventory, but there wouldn't have been any kind of structural checking off of the inventory or strategic checking off of the inventory. They just get the inventory, they read through it quick and they sign it. I think the onus is on the landlord, and this is a very important point, to be present with the tenant and to make sure that it is executed in the manner that satisfies both parties, so there's no ambiguity or doubt or dispute come checkout time.
Sure.
As to the condition of the property.
And another point to make too is that an inventory is just not at the start of a tenancy. An inventory can change and be updated throughout a tenancy. For instance, if a landlord replaces a vacuum cleaner, or if a landlord replaces a washing machine, or even paints the property in between a tenancy, that the inventory and the condition statement
must be updated accordingly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. That's not just a fixed document at the start. There may be nothing throughout a tenancy, but it's important that if something is added or changed during the tenancy, that it's updated. So that's another important point.
And again, these things can be done in person, because during the inspections, let's say, which is another important aspect of the whole tenancy management and tenancy care, is that the landlord should carry out periodic inspections of the property in person. Yeah. With the inventory. And the tenant there with the inventory, and they agree the condition now with regard to what it was at the start of the tenancy, and as you say, if there's updates to be made at that point, that's done again and executed and agreed by both.
Yeah, and just another point on the inspections is I would always recommend that a landlord would visit a property 6 weeks to 8 weeks after a tenant moves in. Initially just to see that they're keeping the property well, that there's no damages, or you'll get a sense after the first 6 to 8 weeks.
You will, how a person is kind of treating the property. And then you can maybe nip any problems and potential problems in the bud.
Early on.
You'd highlight any issues.
And after inspections, it's very important to record the inspection, and indeed to send a note to the tenant to just to confirm the inspection, that you did meet with them, and anything untoward that you found as a landlord in the property, send a note. You mightn't get around to updating the inventory or the condition statement at the time, but just have a note, have an email, have some sort of a record with the tenant of anything that was noted, so that everybody's in the flow and everybody's aware throughout the tenancy.
I think the main point on that is, come check out at the end of the tenancy, both parties are there, all updates and records are there, so there shouldn't be any dispute. But if there is a dispute, there could be a case where,
if it's all been handled well and recorded well and managed well throughout the tenancy, there shouldn't be issues at the end of the tenancy.
But you'll find when the records aren't kept properly, tenants-wise,
this is where the problems arise.
Yeah. I mean, most of the problems we see between landlords and tenants invariably would be due to deposit retention. Unfairly in the tenant's eyes, but fully justified in the landlord's eyes. But the absence of records will just cloud the whole issue. All of a sudden, the tenant is going to the PRTB, making a claim against the landlord, and both parties are sucked into this this process, which is time consuming and
for
costly.
everybody.
And that's where the records then. That's where your evidence is put on the table, and that's how adjudication will be
exactly.
reached.
And also, just a quick point on the PRTB, if you do end up in the PRTB, a landlord that's seen to have had fully kept full records and accurate records throughout a tenancy is always viewed favourably in the eyes of the PRTB. It always views favourably, for the landlord.
But unfortunately, that's not usually the case, as we know.
Absolutely.
Invariably, in our experience,
the
landlord is found wanting with regard to the record keeping and the tenancy management and general tenancy care during the process. And in that case, it's invariably an open and shut case in favour of the tenant.
Sure, and that's certainly what we would have seen. And some of the other things that a landlord should know is, with the rent collection, it's important that a direct debit is set up for rent collections, and that it's monitored and checked, regularly by landlords. Keeping a direct debit is great, but also keeping record and having your own files, a proper file and records of rent payments and the due dates, and following up very quickly afterwards if it's not paid. And obviously, there's a whole process for that as well. If a tenant does renege on payments or is in arrears for payments, there is a process, and a lot of landlords are not aware of that. There is a statutory process for following up on arrears of rent. There's statutory letters, as part of the whole Part 4 and Part 4 tenancies and the Tenancies Act. There is now a statutory process and statutory letters that have to be issued to tenants in the case of arrears. And again, it's something that landlords have to be aware of.
Yeah, I think the days of the landlord knocking on the door to collect the rent are long gone, kind of thing.
Or just
everything's
sending a text or an email.
Yeah.
It's not enough. There is a statutory process.
Yeah, and again, if there is a dispute and the landlord is chasing a tenant for rent arrears, they would have to show that they were collecting the rent in an appropriate fashion. All records again are up to date and so on. There used to be a case at a time where landlords were collecting cash money from rent, knocking on the door at a certain time of month for the tenant to give them the rent, and maybe the due tax mightn't have been declared or whatever. That's very much in the past, as we've seen in the last number of years. So, it's a very efficient way for landlords to collect rent, direct debit or standing order. But it mostly, if the rent is missed, that it's seen very, very early on. It can be dealt with accordingly.
And that's the records.
We've seen in times gone by, more than once, thankfully not too often, landlords would come to us where they would have rented their property and come to us looking for advice based on, they haven't received rent in 6 months, how do they get it from the tenant? Well, invariably it's too late at that stage. The tenant is going to pack up and leave rather than fork out a big lump sum. Because the landlord may not have been checking their bank records or whatever. You might find that astonishing or hard to believe, but we've seen it happen. But if there's proper rent control procedures put in place, that should never happen. And thankfully, we haven't seen that in a good number of years now.
In a while, yeah. But again, it's so important, that the rents are managed, and again, rent arrears, that the statutory process is followed. Inspections, we touched a little bit on that, but again, I think the regular inspections is very important. As I said, 6 to 8 weeks after the tenant moves in, and then 6 monthly thereafter. That I would strongly recommend that landlords would visit the property again within 6 months, and more importantly, if they haven't visited during the tenancy, extremely important to visit at least a month before a tenant is due to vacate. As soon as a tenant says that they're leaving, the landlord should move in, get in quickly, and carry out an inspection. And it's a kind of a pre-checkout. It preempts any problems that there may be at checkout time when a tenant is vacating and looking for their deposit back. If you haven't been in there and given yourself time to assess a good number of weeks before the tenant moves out, well, again, that leads to problems down the line.
It's a perfect opportunity also, as it would be in any kind of standard lease agreement, that the landlord or their agent would be entitled to access the property during their notice period for the purpose of showing it to potential replacement tenants. So it's a good idea for the landlord to go in and make sure the property is presentable enough, and it's an opportunity to speak to the tenant and advise them or remind them that they should keep the property in an appropriate condition, for viewings and so on and so forth during the notice period as well. Because if it's not going to present well, it might be harder to get a tenant, and you could suffer a void period.
Absolutely, yeah. And then when it comes to the checkout, when a tenant is vacating, it's important that again that you have the conversation that you are looking to if a landlord is looking to relet, then that the tenant will allow access for either an agent or the landlord to have access for viewings for reletting. One of the other important points that I think we should make for landlords is maintenance. regular maintenance updates in the property, keeping the property in good tenantable conditions. And again, there's the housing, the statutory housing regulations where a landlord is obliged to keep the property in a certain condition, and the utilities and facilities within the house are kept to a certain standard. That is statutory. But other than that, just general maintenance. When a tenant calls to report a maintenance problem, be it a plumbing or electrical or whatever, that a landlord would act fairly quickly.
Yeah, deal with it efficiently.
And again, tenants, as we know, the market today is such that tenants are staying in properties longer, and your tenants are treating their properties like home, that they do require fast action when they report a maintenance problem. They require fast
even
action.
on an economic footing. I mean, the sooner something is dealt with, invariably, the less costly the remedy will be as well. Because if something is ignored, like a leak, as you know, can take a while to manifest itself, really.
Sure.
And if a tenant is complaining about a leaky faucet or something like that, and the landlord says, "Oh yes, I'll deal with that next week or next month or whatever," and they don't, deal with it efficiently, that little leaky faucet could become quite a serious problem.
Sure.
And not only that, but it breeds discontent with the tenant, and it affects the relationship between the tenant and the landlord. But ultimately, it could cost the landlord far more to fix the situation than it might have been if they had dealt with it efficiently when the problem was first highlighted by the tenant.
Absolutely, yeah. So the other important point is when the tenant is checking out of a property at the end of the tenancy, when a tenant is leaving, as we mentioned, the check-in of the property at the beginning being very important, and the inventory and the condition statement. Then at the end of the tenancy, it comes back into play again, where the inventory and the condition statement really becomes a very, very important point. The landlord needs to attend at the property with the tenant when they're checking out, and check the inventory and check the conditions that were signed and agreed when the tenant moved in. And if there are any deviations to the inventory and the condition statement at that time, then that's when it is discussed and agreed. So again, to make sure that everybody and I find a lot where landlords don't attend to the checkout. That's where the problems come down later when it comes to refunding the deposit and the disputes and all of that. Attend at the checkout with the tenant. Go through the inventory and agree that everything is as it should be or as it was, and if not, it has to be dealt with accordingly. But
again, very simple. If it's done correctly at the outset, with the check-in and during the inspections, record upkeeping and updating and so on, there should be no problem whatsoever, no disputes at checkout.
Yeah. There shouldn't be. I mean, it's, as you say, if things are not always right and things are not, they're always maybe some small wear and tear obviously is always accepted, and general wear and tear is would be seen as acceptable. But anything above and beyond that, it's not, and that's a whole sort of different discussion, I suppose. For another day. But that's our advices, and following our 22 years experience in the business now, there would be certain tips that we would give. But feel free to contact Christies, and either myself or Richard or any of the team at Christies if you have any other questions in relation to letting or managing properties. We would be delighted to help.
Our email address is info@christiespmp.com. Our telephone 01 667 0099. Thanks for watching.
Thanks.